Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for May 13th, 2022, Friday the 13th. I want to begin, as I mentioned yesterday, by sending congratulations to the people of the Philippines who elected a new government, one which is not very popular with the globalists, with the proponents of the Great Reset, the supporters of a containment policy against China. But most importantly, it reflects the view of people in the former colonial sector that they're not willing to submit to the demands of the global financial elite. In 1986, there was a coup against Ferdinand Marcos, then the president of the Philippines. He was accused of all sorts of things. There's an excellent article written by my associate Mike Billington on February 19th, 2021. It was published, called How Economic Hitman George Shultz Destroyed the Philippines. And what Mike reports is that Marcos was committed to full-scale economic development of the Philippines as a sovereign nation, committed to the idea of developing nuclear power, which was frowned upon by the globalists who had already murdered the president of Pakistan, Bhutto, because of his nuclear energy program. Marcos carried out an agricultural revolution to make the Philippines self-sufficient in rice. He had an industrial development project with a number of industrial centers that were being constructed. And he was attacked. By the way, he was also pro-China at the time. He was attacked by Shultz, by the neocons in the Reagan administration, and was driven out of office in the first color revolution. Now, the son, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., just won an election in an astounding landslide, 31 million votes to 14 million votes. He's attacked in the press, in the Western press, as the son of the dictator, as someone who might be a puppet of China, and so on and so forth. Now, he made his main campaign issue managing and advancing the economy. He made it clear that he's not going to go along with the containment policy of the West against China. But we still don't know what he's going to do. What we do know is that the people of the Philippines sent a resounding middle finger to the bankers who destroyed their country 30-something years ago, and basically said, we want to develop our nation for our people. We want a sovereign nation. And this is a signal that was sent repeatedly in the efforts to the globalists in their attempts to get former colonies to turn against Russia in the Ukraine situation. They're not having it. They may not agree with Russia's policy toward Ukraine, but they certainly don't agree with the British and the United States insisting that the rules-based order is determined in Washington and London and Brussels, and every other nation must submit to it. That's the Great Reset. That's the policy of the Green New Deal. Either you do what we say or we crush you. Now, that was done in the past to countries like Libya, Iraq, to Ukraine, to Yugoslavia. But when the West tries to take on Russia, it's a different situation. And the fact that the Russians and the Chinese are still committed to sovereignty has encouraged countries such as India, South Africa, Brazil, Mexico to stand up against the powers of the transatlantic world. And we're seeing now opposition developing in Italy, opposition in Germany, opposition in France, opposition in England to the Johnson government, because Boris Johnson and his hatchet man, Liz Truss, are at the center of the arming of Ukraine, the sanctions policy, which is destroying their own people. So take heart. Look what happened in the Philippines. Almost a 2-to-1 vote for Ferdinand Marcos Jr. We'll see what he does, but I'm very hopeful because he has the people behind him. And the potential for this kind of movement to spread worldwide is what will defeat the globalists today. Now, since it's Friday, I have a couple of questions that came in. The first one was, what's the purpose of the Disinformation Governance Board? I just wrote an article that will be posted on my blog page at thelaroucheorganization.com, which should be up by Saturday or Sunday, going through the history of Nina Yankovic, who is the czarina of the censorship board. What's interesting to look at is what she was doing in Ukraine in 2016 and 2017, when she worked with an organization called Stop Fake, which was set up after the Maidan coup in February 2014 to counter, quote, Russian disinformation, unquote. What's interesting, and what you'll find this in my article, is that in working with Stop Fake, she was promoting the line that the neo-Nazi militias, such as Azov and others, that were crucial in making the coup in 2014, funded by Soros, funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, which, by the way, paid her salary when she was working in Ukraine, that these agencies were committed at that time in 2014 to use Ukraine against Russia. And the Stop Fake was the first of the so-called fact-checking institutions that was used to counter so-called disinformation. And what do? They promote disinformation, just like Nina J. does. When she does her stories about Trump was responsible for the Hunter Biden laptop, when she gives credibility to Christopher Steele, she's a disinformation operative, not an expert, an operative. And it's clear when she was defending the neo-Nazi militia in Ukraine in 2016 and 2017, which she's still doing today, that she's operating on behalf of the war party. And this goes back to Obama and Obama's commitment after 2016 to shut down social media. And this was made clear by Obama in a speech at Stanford University in 2021. 2022, just days before the announcement of the Disinformation Governance Board, where he said that something has to be done to regulate free speech, that free speech is a threat to, quote, our democracy, unquote. So that's what you're getting with the Disinformation Governance Board, a censorship body that's operating on behalf of the war party and the Great Reset. Second question is, what's behind all these moves against sovereignty? This was from several people. The Great Reset, the so-called health emergency plan being worked out by the World Health Organization. What's the goal? How do we fight it? Well, the goal is to destroy the sovereign nation state. This was laid out by Walt Wriston, the Citibank banker back in the 1980s when he wrote a book called Twilight of Sovereignty. This goes back longer than that. The idea of sovereign nation states that act in the interests of their people as opposed to the interests of the global cartels, that's what the fight is about. And unfortunately, since 1971, the global cartels have taken over most governments in the West, including the United States, both parties in the United States, the media in the United States, the think tanks, the universities. They are controlled by these global trusts, global cartels, especially the financial and insurance and the investment bankers and so on. They control the institutions. They don't want national governments to impose regulations that would force them to act for the interests of a nation. The idea of a national mission is not our nation first and only. The idea of a national mission is that you wish to do something so that your nation acts for the good, for peace and prosperity for all nations. And what we're looking for with the Peace of Westphalia conception in Helga Zepp-LaRouche's fight for a new financial and strategic architecture is that we must have nations committed to act for the general welfare of all nations. Every nation deserves security guarantees. And these security guarantees include the right to control their credit and currency and their investment policy. and not to surrender that, whether it's over a so-called health emergency, whether it's over a war, whether it's over climate change. The only way this world will function is with sovereign states allowing the citizens of those states to make the decisions for the future, as opposed to surrendering sovereignty to multinational corporations. So that's what the issue of sovereignty is. It's a crucial question, and this is something Lyndon LaRouche wrote about repeatedly. And the central theme that's often there in LaRouche's writings is the question of credit. Who controls credit and where it goes? At present, credit is controlled by the handful of financial oligarchs who use it to protect their debt-ridden financial or corporate entities, and instead shut down physical economic production. That's what the fight of sovereignty is about. And how do you win it? Look at the Philippines. They just had a landslide election, which I'm convinced was based on this principle of the people of the Philippines insisting that they want to be a sovereign nation. That's what every person in the United States has to fight for. That's what we should be fighting for in Europe. Sovereignty, not the phony federalism of the European Union. Now, the final question was, I'll just take quickly. Someone asked, well, you're worried about nuclear warfare. Couldn't Russia use some other technology, for example, electromagnetic pulse weapons to take out defense, the U.S. defenses, our infrastructure grid, and so on? Well, of course they could. The Russians have those weapons, so does the United States. The question is, will there be sanity in these relations, or will we go to an all-out war? Because the idea that you can use pinpoint technologies to take out installations, to take out capabilities, it's still warfare. Just as the economic warfare against Russia not only harms the Russian people, but is harming people all over the world with the sanctions policy. So the question is not what weapons will be used. The panoply of weapons that are available, we're almost already opening the Pandora's box. And once that's open, the world is going to be engulfed in a war to the end. Instead, we need to fight for a diplomatic solution. We need to fight for security guarantees for all nations. And among those security guarantees are a just economic order. That doesn't mean a top-down controlled order. It means an economic order which has agreements, treaty agreements on currencies, treaty agreements on trade between sovereign nations that will be resolved by those nations with their trading partners, not by institutions and bureaucracies controlled by bankers and insurance companies. That's the fight that we have to wage. And don't get so caught up in which technologies would work and what would be a better way of fighting a war. War itself is destructive. No one is happy to see the destruction of the cities of Ukraine and the population of Ukraine. Of course, you're being lied to about how much destruction there is by the media, which is trying to paint Russia as barbarians. But no one can take great love or hope from war. The best thing to do with war is to stop it and to achieve a durable peace based on cooperation and development. So that's my update for today. I wish you a good weekend, and we'll see you again next week.